Welcome to This Explainer. We're jumping right into Professor Blankenship's lectures today to decode what you might call the hidden engine of contract law. Have you ever wondered why some promises hold up in a court of law, while others just kind of evaporate the second someone changes their mind? Well, it all comes down to a really foundational concept called consideration. So, picture this. Your rich uncle promises you $5,000 to stop swearing, drinking, and smoking for a few years. You actually do it, but then he refuses to pay up. Can you sue him? Keep this wild, real-world historical scenario in the back of your mind as we go, because the answer is absolutely key to unlocking how contract law actually works in practice. To figure that out, we need to know what transforms an everyday promise into a legally enforceable contract, which brings us to Section 1, the engine of contracts. For a promise to have legal teeth, both parties actually have to take on an obligation that binds them. You can't just have someone making a gratuitous promise where they can walk away whenever they feel like it. That brings us to the very definition of consideration. It's the mutual exchange of promises or obligations between the parties to a contract. It's a two-way street, right? Both sides got to bring something to the table. And this brings us straight back to our uncle's scenario. This is a famous 1891 case from Professor Blankenship's lectures called Hamer versus Sidway. In an 1875 letter, Uncle William literally wrote, "You shall have $5,000, as I promised you." He was offering his nephew, Willie, a massive payout to just drop the drinking, smoking, and swearing until he turned 21. Well, Willie did it. He turned 21, kept his word, and asked for his $5,000, which, by the way, was an absolute fortune back in the 1800s. But the uncle's estate later refused to pay. They argued there was no valid consideration to make this a binding contract because Willie wasn't actually harmed by giving up his vices. In fact, they said giving up drinking and smoking was good for him, so no harm meant no contract. Let's see how the courts handled that logic in Section 2, the bargain for exchange. The core rule the courts use here is mutual inducement. It's basically the I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine of the legal world. As it's formalized in the Restatement Second of Contracts, Section 71, a bargain for exchange means a performance or return promise is sought by the promisor in exchange for their promise, and given by the promisee in exchange for that promise. In plain English, my promise induces you to act, and your action induces me to make my promise. Let's step out of the 19th century for a second and apply this to a super relatable example from Professor Blankenship's lectures. Say you're looking to hire a house painter. If you just have a chat with them, is that a contract? Well, if I say, hey, I might pay you to paint my house, that's not a firm commitment. There's no bargain there. The law calls that a gratuitous or illusory promise. But if I say, I will pay you exactly $1,000 to paint my house, boom, that is a perfect bargain for exchange. The money induces the painting, and the painting induces the money. But what happens when the exchange doesn't involve a clear financial transaction, like paying that house painter? This leads us to Section 3, detriment versus actual benefit. What's truly fascinating here is how courts actually shifted away from looking for an actual benefit to the promisor and instead started looking for a legal detriment suffered by the promisee. Historically, people thought consideration meant someone physically had to get richer, but modern law says that giving up a legal right, abandoning a privilege, or just limiting your future freedom of action is perfectly valid consideration, even if absolutely zero money changes hands. Returning to Hamer versus Sidway, the court actually ruled in Willie's favor. See, Willie had a legal right to drink, smoke, and swear in the 1800s, and he abandoned that right entirely based on the strength of his uncle's promise. Because restricting his lawful freedom of action was a valid legal detriment, the court decided it didn't matter one bit if it improved his health or if his uncle didn't make a dime off it. That restriction meant the $5,000 contract was absolutely binding. Professor Blankenship's lectures highlight another wild case, the Pioneer Theater case. It proves that even the most mundane acts can count as a legal detriment if it's exactly what the promisor bargained for. A woman won a theater raffle without even buying a ticket, and the theater refused to pay, claiming no consideration. But the court ruled that by signing the theater's register, waiting outside, and literally sprinting to claim the prize within 3 minutes, she restricted her freedom of action. She did exactly what they asked, and that created a binding contract. So we know what consideration is, but we also need to know when the engine breaks down completely. Let's explore Section 4, when consideration fails.
There are strict boundaries here. If you perform a pre-existing duty or rely on a moral obligation, courts will just flat out reject it. Past actions, moral obligations, illusory promises, and pre-existing legal duties simply do not count as a valid bargain for exchange. You can't bargain for something that has already happened or something you're already legally forced to do anyway.
Let's look at these failures in action. Take the famous case of Mills versus Wyman. Caring for a sick adult son out of the goodness of your heart is wonderful, but if the father later promises to reimburse you, that fails. Why? Because it's based on a moral obligation and a past action. Likewise, a policeman can't charge you a personal fee for preventing a crime, because that's his pre-existing legal duty. And agreeing to bring someone back from the dead? I mean, come on, that fails immediately as an illusory, impossible promise.
But just when you think you have the rule perfectly figured out, contract law throws us a total curveball. Let's look at Section 5, Exceptions to the Rule.
What happens when there is absolutely no bargain to be found, but someone still gets really hurt by a broken promise?
Well, if you make a promise expecting someone to rely on it and they do so to their detriment, public policy actually steps in to prevent injustice. This is through a doctrine called promissory estoppel. Even without a bargain for exchange, if backing out of your promise would leave the other party unjustly harmed after they trusted your word, the court is going to hold you to that promise.
Professor Blankenship also outlines some other fascinating exceptions. For instance, if you voluntarily promise to repay a debt that was already totally wiped out in bankruptcy court, that instantly creates a new legally binding obligation without any new consideration. The same thing applies to promising to repay a time-barred debt where the statute of limitations is already run out. In these highly specific cases, the law allows the promise itself to act as the binding force.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to evaluate your own agreements. Think about your recent promises. Did you make a true bargain for exchange, or was it just a gratuitous promise? Whether it's doing a favor for a friend or signing a major business deal, every binding agreement relies on that all-important engine of consideration. So next time you make a deal, remember Uncle William and Willie. Ask yourself, are you truly exchanging legal detriments, or is it just hot air? Thanks for joining me to decode the engine of contracts.